Hello dear Knooking fans, in this video I'll show you how to do Kitchener stitch with knooking. Kitchener stitch is a way of doing a seam and it looks exactly like a normally nooked row of stitches. So in my case it's knit stitch and I did the seam, the Kitchener stitch in knit stitch. And because I used here a yellow thread, you can perfectly see how it looks like. But if you choose this thread in the same color as the rest of your work, it will be invisible. So Kitchener stitch is very suitable for example socks. When you work your socks top down and you need to close them at the toes, then Kitchener stitch is just ideal because it won't give you any ridge inside, and also it's flexible and it doesn't stand out. You can use Kitchener stitch as well for closing, for example, a cushion cover that you nooked in the round and then you need to close it at the top. Or you can use Kitchener stitch for even closing shoulder seams. So if you want seams at the shoulders that are not visible and that are more flexible, Kitchener stitch is the way to go. In order to make this work sample, I used Super Bingo from Lana Grossa, and I used knooking hook number 6 millimeter, and for doing Kitchener stitch I use a tapestry needle. What you need as well is a pair of scissors. Alright, let's do Kitchener stitch for knooking. So for Kitchener stitch it's ideal if you have an even number of stitches. My work sample has 24 stitches altogether. So when I put the two sides together, I have 12 stitches in the front and 12 stitches in the back. When describing the steps of how to do Kitchener stitch, I will not change the perspective. So when I say go into the stitch knitwise in the front, then I mean that. If I say go into the stitch knitwise on the back, I mean this. If I say go into the stitch purlwise in the front, I mean this. And when I say go into the stitch purlwise in the back, I also mean that. Okay. So now it's time to cut off your thread, your little strand from your knooking hook. And before you cut off your working yarn, you should measure it. So it needs to be 3 or 4 times the length of your seam. So that would be enough, and you could cut it off here. I cut off this thread already and left it a bit longer. Okay, let's start with Kitchener stitch. So first you need to get this thread onto a tapestry needle. Okay, so your thread is on the back and we're going to do the first stitch at the front. So now we go into this first stitch purlwise. I just need to make sure it doesn't split the strand. Okay, pull it through, but not too tight. Okay, so now we go back into the first stitch of the back, and we also go in there purlwise. Make sure that the strand is below our thread. Okay, now we go into the next stitch of the back, but this time knitwise. Now we go back to the first stitch of the front, also knitwise. So now with this yellow thread, we can already see that we created a knit stitch, a knitted stitch. It looks like knitted. It's a bit big, but we can adjust this later. So now we've gone into 2 stitches purlwise, and then into 2 stitches knitwise, and now it starts repeating. So into the next stitch on the front, we go purlwise. Then on the last stitch of the back, we also go in purlwise. It's a bit tricky to see it, so just make sure you go into this hole where the thread comes out. So it's this. Okay, so now we go into the next stitch knitwise again. And back into the front knitwise. Then we repeat purlwise. And on the back purlwise. Next one knitwise. Back at the front knitwise. So now you can actually perfectly see a knitted seam. It looks exactly like the stitches of my whole work, just the size isn't right. But now I can tell you a very nice trick about Kitchener stitch, because you can adjust the size of your stitches. You can make them smaller. All you need to do is just to drag the thread here and then do this for every stitch. So you drag it, you can do that with your needle or with your fingers, whatever works best for you. And you can see the stitches are already smaller than they were before. Now you can do this as long as you need to and until you're happy with the size and it matches with the rest of your work. We can also now remove the strand partly, which gives you a better impression of what it's going to look like at the end. So when you have finished your seam with Kitchener stitch, you just pull out the rest of your strand. You can either do this with a knooking hook, or you just use your fingers, just the way it works best for you. And finally, you need to get your thread inside. So go in there and then turn your work over and sew in the end of your thread. That's it. I hope this video was helpful and you enjoyed it. And if you like, you can subscribe to my channel. Thank you and see you next time. Bye bye.